Good afternoon, gentle readers, fellow earthlings. Today is another episode of Logos 2000, 21st century, about foundations of mathematics, physics, science, logic, a bit of metaphysics, the briefest bit, a merest account that holds things together. The study yesterday, or the previous episode, was a study into Nozick's philosophical explanations, a significant chapter of which is why is there something rather than nothing, the fundamental question of metaphysics. And then what does that arrive at? And how can the principle of sufficient reason be satisfied for things like Leibniz's principle of perfection, which is why there's infinity as in, again, and that after it's arrived that Duns Scotus has the infinity as in, that Spinoza also has it kind of so, and then that Leibniz very, very much has it as part and parcel of his deliberations, and of course we can point to the great success and vibrancy of today's integral analysis and differential analysis is using Leibniz's notation for the integral bar for summation. It's kind of an S for summation, and Leibniz's notation for the differential D, or partial D, script D, or little Greek D for the differential and partial differential. Leibniz's notation for the calculus, that the results in the calculus, as were kind of described here last time, are perfect and super classical results. There is a consideration that mathematics in its development has seen several kind of touchstones of significant matters of the superclassical available only to reasoning and the infinitary reasoning, the geometric series, these iota values as standard, constant infinitesimals, the particle wave duality, calculus in the fundamental theorems of the derivative and integral, the fundamental theorems of calculus, and as well the development of the Dirac delta, and then later that being used to formalize the Fourier style analysis, which already existed and was found, and they had to derive the coefficients and give numbers for it. It was given kind of this formalism to arrive at, that this least, briefest, merest superclassical account after the Dirac delta for the Feher and Dirichlet kernels make for a formalization of why the Fourier style analysis adds up. Of course, if you study these podcasts or follow them for some time back, then there was an idea in the description of the derivation of the Fourier style analysis that some of those results that go into making why it stacks neatly up a very, very high stack of carefully balanced and don't look at it sideways or breathe too hard, a tower of results. The derivation of the Fourier style analysis has among those various what are deemed uniqueness results that could also be seen as distinctness results quite plainly, and that there are many ways to find out how to make deconstructive accounts of these things that are put forward to add up, in so far as to describe how it's so, to bring how it's so, that they have these more replete examples of their being, their existing. So today, well, I found at the bookstore another book about metaphysics, and so this is Heidegger on metaphysics, and I have another copy of it, I think, but I found that, and after reading from Nozick, I can only imagine, being that Nozick quotes him quite thoroughly, and things like the organic unity and stuff, that it's after a close reading of Heidegger, who here is kind of held up as bringing time back into the picture, and then being one of these three anti-Platos with Wittgenstein and Nietzsche, of sorts of like the ends of metaphysics and ends of the omni and the ends of the history, that it has to be brought in again. So he's considered sort of, as it was put, the angsty, anxious hen Heidegger. That as well, there's much mention of the logos and its relation of logos to metaphysics and what it means as far as a term. And it's usually written in the Greek, like with lambda, omicron, gamma, omicron, sigma, logos. It's just a regular term in that sense. So I thought I'd read from that a bit. Then I have here a copy of Copleston's History of Philosophers, and it's only the volume 4 from Descartes to Leibniz. So Leibniz is another a great metaphysician in a sense. He's a scientist. He's a mathematician. He's a grammarian. He's really a pretty thorough thinker. Is Leibniz? In fact, he's held up to be one of the greats of all matters of thought, and in foundations, the monadology, and that Leibniz very well and firmly establishes that infinity is in and has always been there, and so that's seen as somewhat rewarding. And then a bit of a book by Will Egginton about Jean-Louis Borges' writings on infinity and continuity that I just thought was a very excellent work. As I started to read it and leaf through it, it had some things that spoke to me as reflecting upon what's otherwise the paradoxical and bringing up these ideas that by reason itself are once so insurmountable yet profound and prominent, the ideas of infinity, that there's much to be made from these, as then they make for these greatest kind of accounts of turning things over, and the ability of mental reasoning and mental apparatus to arrive at otherwise unsurmountable things that can't be arrived at via the plainly mechanical of by the finite means. So it just goes to show that that's considered as a very very interesting course. So with that said, I shall hope today to find some insight from these works, and that thusly in this kind of learning trail, that it helps to bring some more ideas into play. Whereas we just got past axiomless natural deduction and the principle of sufficient reason as being enough for it. That's something that, that it once, like, somebody who's been studying foundations for a long time might have found these issues a long time ago. And that then to bring them to light again helps to establish and explain this, like, well, yeah, that is primary throughout. That's a great thing. Let's see what we can find today in this. So Copleston, he was a Jesuit priest. So he was an Englishman, and so that would have meant he was brought up Anglican, and then he decided to convert to Roman Catholicism. And just because he said it was the one that fit his idea of the things of best. And so that said, it's not so much when he reads the philosophers that he has an axe to grind, nor does he have any particular point to make. But he does have this stuff that's kind of relates that the thinking historically, before we get to logical positivism and devout atheism, I guess you could call it, that the atheism is a religion. It's what people bind themselves to. And that here it's expressed that there is, the agnosticism and the agnosticism is that's fair, and that there's freedom of religion. It's one of the greatest given rights given to men in modern times by what would be seen as the best examples of systems of government according to participatory democracy. The religious freedom, then that has here that's just framed up above as in terms of up above the super scientific, supernatural, and super sensuous is the omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient. The omni above the super, and then for those comparatives and superlatives, then that's just out of that only this briefest, merest silver thread does arrive for things like the principle of sufficient reason and what ontological status, ontological activity, and ontological commitment then arrives to be so considered reciprocal and fair to oneself and others for intersubjectivity and interobjectivity these ways. So Copleston, I just wanted to quote a couple things he read about Leibniz. And so these are some quotes he had. So he's discussing the monad, about atomism, and then about the atoms, and atoms, or, it's turtles. Where? On the back of a turtle. Where? On the back of a turtle. It's turtles all the way down. That's atomism with regards to Democritus, who's generally given the idea that when Aristotle had to put aside atomism so that he could keep the Archimedean, after he had entertained both and made sure to establish in his dialectic that both constructive accounts were given, and then that he makes a stroke deciding that after that there's no vacuum in nature, that there's kind of a omnipresent substance, say, or Aristotle's, as it's usually read as what's Aristotelian, is that it's given to Democritus then that the flip side of this, or as discussed in one of these other episodes, why it is so that out of that one combined school of all the different accounts that all have to be replete together eventually, that when it was found that there was a schism only according to inductive inference, that it was given this easier trail and something that is quite utterly simplified, the inductive inference, and then that's called Aristotleanism, but the fuller Aristotleanism still includes his other constructive results, which stand for themselves. Then building the bridges between those is after these analytical bridges, or analytische Brücken, is a way to make so that there's a thorough Aristotelianism as with regards to as some of the readings intend to convey, that a lot of Aristotelianism was arrived at as a gift from his uncle, a lot of the fragments and so on, besides the Platonic and Socratic schools, that there's another influence that's less recorded in the history of the things. But it's still just called Aristotelian, the great confluence and concordance of classical thought. So the monad is an account of atomism and atomism and atomism again. It mentions Democritus or of Epicurus, but Epicurus is kind of let out. He says, indeed, a certain resemblance between monads and the atoms of the philosophers, but the atoms of Epicurus possess shape, even though they were asserted to be indivisible. That we usually think of those as just bodies. The Epicurean, it was just very, very phenomenological. Vis-a-vis the Platonic, it's that the Epicurean is also kind of anti-Platonic. And so that said, it's seen here to kind of arrive at being Platonic again, kind of like Gadamer says at the end of his writings. He says, amicus Plato, our friend is Plato. That here as well, it's just to give an idea of what modes of thinking go into making these for their constructive and inductively inferred accounts, that makes for as well these deductive accounts more repletely, more thoroughly, more fully. So in this section, what he had was a great quote about that Leibniz freed himself from the Aristotelian, and then what he considered after that was the void and these things. That in it, one of the quotes here that I wanted to read was, he's talking about defining the infinite. I am so much in favor of the actual infinite that instead of admitting that nature abhors it, as is commonly said, I hold that it affects it everywhere in order better to work the perfections of its author. So here, this is after the principle of sufficient reason, and when it wasn't given, that the principle of sufficient reason from the nothing and something, because that's always kind of like this third rail that nobody ever touches, is the nothing and something bit. After that, then, given that there's a way to have for the principle of sufficient reason that infinity is first. It's not just in, it's first. Continuity isn't just in, it's first with regards to a dual holistic monism in the things, substances, the intellicies, and all these forms, that Leibniz makes a very strong statement, bringing in what was otherwise through all of what's called Aristotlean, that there's only potential infinity to count upon, because it's finger counting, and that's something that all sorts of learners can accommodate. That there's as well a real mental apparatus and faculty that arrives at actual infinity. And here, a mere mathematical infinity of a scalar sort. One of the other great superclassical notions of the infinity is the transfinite. And so this is after York-Cantor and the cardinal numbers, when they become the transfinite cardinal numbers. Because the finite cardinal numbers are simple. It's equated with an act of making a count. And the ordinals, for example, is just as of an order by a serial order. And then the integral numbers, as are discussed here, kind of as what make the whole numbers, the integers, the integral numbers, are as from either the account of being of cardinals and ordinals, or their being where the reals and rationals come together and equate. And that they equate with having the modularity established for an algebra in a ring in a field of the rationals, and then very much so then for this group in the integers. So there's a lot. These are parts of the Hino theory, that the same objects that are the numbers, the integers, are arrived at from these different ways. They also fulfill being in these different ways. There are fragments and extensions in each of these ways. So what it works out is that there are all these different ways. That the standard linear curriculum and standard given account starts from after 12 years of schooling, this is how we'd like to kind of follow that with a foundations of the integers. And like Kronecker said, is like the integers are given, everything else is just built on them. But they're actually possibly just built also. So there's deconstructive accounts arrived for the Hino theory that there are reasons why they always bring themselves back in the integers, and it is so this way. So this other quote, he's talking about leaps in continuity and why in nature everything must be leapless or gapless. Well, at the same time, according to inductive inference, and like after Zeno's arguments, that there's only leaps and gaps. And at the same time, after deductive account arrives at, again, the geometric series in superclassical thinking, that he quotes Leibniz as saying, "Nothing is accomplished all at once, and is one of my great maxims, and one of the most completely verified, that nature makes no leaps, a maxim which I call the law of continuity. Nature makes no leaps." And so then after principle of sufficient reason, to make sure that the law of continuity holds up, then he says there's a principle of perfection in the case that man is imperfect and finite, and absent this briefest account of a merest silver thread of time as continuity in a mathematical infinity. As, for example, Spinoza definitely introduces, and then Duns Scotus is giving an argument why it is so, and that it can be received, and that it can be given, this idea of mathematical infinity. The geometrical theorems, Leibniz's panlogism, is only one aspect of his thought. So Copleston here addresses that Leibniz wrote like tens of thousands of essays, and all these different things, like 40 shelved volumes of works that are still being gone over. Kind of like when we talked about Frege or Frege, I usually say Frege, but you often hear Frege, that about Leibniz or Leibniz or Leibniz or Leibniz variously, that is spelled, usually you'd think it would sound L-E-I, so it'd be Leibniz. That most often I've heard it or would read it as spelled the same way, but pronounced the opposite way. That according to the pronunciation rule, I before E or E before I in Teutonic languages like so, that it's pronounced whatever way and spelled with or without a T to make Leibniz or Leibniz. That after Frege having all these other works, certainly Poincaré and that when Copleston reflects on Leibniz's panlogism and all this kind of stuff, is that he really was a universal thinker compared to just trying to say, here we're just going to have one simple foundations and our role isn't to explore all these different ways and pick them up and put them down and wander along the beach and explore every little shell and pond and tidal pool and give each one a name. Instead, to figure out, it's like, what is a beach and where is it here, and these kinds of things. Making for our foundations, it's a much, much abbreviated and simpler course, while still fulfilling and still arriving at the needful principles, and then reflecting other ones that are brought in to repair things, as of course to some treatment and play of the universal, so it arrives at the principle of sufficient reason again is thoroughly satisfied and thoroughly satisfying. That these are the kinds of things. So with that said, then we'll take a look here at one other particular thing I wanted to mention was really about the principle of sufficient reason. And so that was as being read from Nozick. And it's just kind of reflects on here that Leibniz brings a law of continuity. So a law of continuity is for when, this is what this analytical bridge, the analytische Brücke is to be. And so it's kind of like Hilbert's postulate of continuity is Leibniz's law of continuity, except Leibniz came up with it about 200 years before, and that Hilbert was just kind of rephrased that in the language of the day after the latest formalism off the presses. So kind of like similarly to how Nozick has organic unity, and then how Leibniz has some similar concepts and notions, and then off of Heidegger as well as some other stuff we're going to get into now. So that's an idea that was like so. Another thing I enjoyed about Copleston is it said he was part of a broadcast debate between Copleston and Russell, and he caught Russell in an inconstant hypocrisy with regards to what he told people is what he said was true, and how he formulated and argumented it, and what he did with other people who had kind of a different way and approach that would beat his reasoning. So it just kind of that kind of gratified me, because although Bertrand Russell is held up as a really great logician and having come up with a bunch of stuff like taking type theory from Charles Sanders Peirce and then stratified and ramified types about orders kind of back and forth in either way in terms of comprehension and quantification. And then there's like the whole 1 + 1 = 2 bit after Principia Mathematica that he kind of read off from, who was that guy? Giuseppe Piano. And then it's only kind of a partial account of that. And then having like this second order equality, because opposite a set doesn't contain itself as a set contain itself, and working up equality and reflexivity of that, and making the logic of the time, or Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica. And then for the retro thesis that goes for an ordinary infinity into set theory, that it's just an example that you could find various accounts of these, and that while it's kind of considered that, you know, that kind of makes an account of things, it also is built from these and after these analytical bridges, that it's not necessary to have those for any particular reasons. It can be arrived at from this axiomless account that's a gift to everybody, for anybody, from nobody, or the higher. So that amused me a little bit. This is the rigor of angels, and it's William Egginton, and he talks about Jorge Luis Borges, Heisenberg, and Immanuel Kant. The nature of free will, the strange fabric of the cosmos, the true limits of the mind. So I really enjoyed reading this so far. He's talking about random occurrence, a popular psychologist, Kant, the epithet of all crushing, university courses, the older generation's best known philosopher. And he's talking about clocks, time and space. Imagine a golf cart, university life in 13th century Europe, scholasticism, primary aim was to reconcile the teachings of Aristotle. See, that's kind of what we're talking about here too, vis-a-vis the severe abstraction and the mechanical reduction that is arrived at, for example, our mechanics of the day, is that doesn't reconcile the teachings of Aristotle, except pick a branch that's mostly not self-contradictory itself. So that goes to show that revisiting the history is how to find these things again, because trying to bolt on and fix and attach a correction above is doomed to fail. Under the combined analysis again of these things is like only the recourse to the revisiting of the things that already kind of are can make for the dual of this monism, the dialectic about it, vis-a-vis saying, oh, well, just imagine a new one and it's perfect, and yet it keeps all this stuff that's derived from its own definitions. That's not the way. That can't be the way. Of course, it helps a lot because there's entire philosophically grounded, logically principled, truth-based account why it's actually arrived at from some of these greater principles. For these first principles, final causes, and the principle of sufficient reason, and for Leibniz, something like a law of continuity and a principle of perfection, as profound. So that'll be interesting a little bit to look at. So Heidegger here is that this is called metaphysics, the fundamental concepts of metaphysics: world, finitude, solitude. So Heidegger in his solitude, in his finitude, he's talking about a reliable measure. What do we need? We need a secure guideline, a reliable measure. If we start from a general characterization once more, then boredom and our passing the time, which is opposed to it now, become clearer to us. So it's said that Heidegger was kind of a hermit in his hut up in the Alps somewhere in the times after his popularization, when the rest of the time he just wanted to get away from it all. And so in his angsty, anxious periods then and all this kind of stuff, as Heidegger the hand of a sort, and that's meant to be friendly, it's not meant to be putting him down, but it is to help reflect that it's not necessarily so that people confronting nihilism and existentialism need to be nihilistic or end off in the existential, the shallow existential. I mean, those can still be deep and not an unhappy place. Heidegger had to confront other things like the terrible turmoil and conflict all around him in that part of the world, and what one would almost hope would be a agonizing divisiveness between his perceived loyalties and to himself and to others. So Heidegger, though, like before, if it was about angst and anxiety, here it's just about his boredom up at his hut. So one thing about going up to be a monastic hermit is you don't so much expect it that really the worst problem is boredom. But so what he says here is that's the worst problem of this thinking in his metaphysics. So I'm happy that I don't really think that's a problem. Although I do understand that the very quality of being bored per se is an unhappy place usually. Besides just the doldrums or catatonia and that kind of stuff, is when it means that the thoughts run away in boredom, vis-a-vis they're just not going anywhere. That it's to be said that it's a variety of perceptual states. So Heidegger here, though, later has something about the logos. And it was quite later in this work. And he's talking about a unity, and here that says with regards, for example, again, what unites and what is united, kind of like what is infinitely divisible and what is infinitely divided, or as with regards to the field and atoms. Certainly we do not mean to imply that this represents the definitive classification of the essence of animality. So here we talk sometimes about like that man is machine and man is animal. and those reflect instincts and reflexes. But man is mind, and so the man is a proper first-class mind, and man here meaning people generally, or men or women, or thinking or feeling beings with mental faculties as mind are above this stuff. And so he seems to be describing mob psychology a little bit instead of necessarily reasoning per se. It's always possible to take up these concepts without their indicative character. Well, it's not always. The use-mentioned distinction is a great thing, but sometimes we carefully choose words to not use words that are derogatory or pejorative or insightful or otherwise inflammatory, because they do hurt even to use them. So that said, the use-mentioned distinction is usually associated instead with matters of logical self-reference and logical self-similarity with what would otherwise arrive as from the quoting of things or the quining of things, sometimes put, or the arithmoquine. Why use-mentioned distinction in logic is also kind of the same thing with regards to avoiding what would be the danger of words vis-a-vis in logic that would mean a contradiction, and so anything could be wrong with it. So here's just goes again kind of that Heidegger's dwelling on these abysmal accounts of all these things, and a lot of people that speaks to a lot of people, because it's not an unusual facet of the human condition, or bête humaine as sometimes it's called, the doldrums of daily dreariness vis-a-vis the uplift and the inside and spirit of things, when it's about technical reason and the fact that there's something at all true that is, according to Leibniz, both continuous and perfect. So I wanted to find where it was at here in this, Heidegger. So he starts to talk about logos. Rather, we do so for reasons which precisely led to the fact that it is this form of statement which has decisively determined the doctrine of discourse in general of the logos, logic. What are these reasons? We are already familiar with them. The fundamental trait of everyday Dasein is that undifferentiated comportment toward beings precisely as something present at hand. The corresponding form of discourse in which such comportment at first and for the most part expresses itself, whether in conversation and narration, in reporting and proclamation, or in scientific discussion, is this undifferentiated habitual form of assertion, A is B. This logos determines the philosophical theory of the logos or logic, because the logos first impresses itself upon us in this form. Indeed, it's something that is also present at hand within everyday human discoursing with one another, and furthermore is the kind of discourse which is predominantly and for the most part present at hand. What is more, the logical theory of the logos as propositional statement came to acquire the dominant position with the theory of the logos in general as discourse and language, i.e. within the field of grammar. So this helps to reflect that logos, the word, through the lens of Heidegger, through the lens of his study, the classics, the ancient Greeks, represents these concepts thoroughly and comprehensively and holistically of the word and logic and grammar and these kinds of things, and as they would have arrived from the aeons before, from the received wisdom and tradition that arrived at the Aristotelian monument, and what we're to make from it, and not just the one approach that's generally considered. So Heidegger is not just held up because he was a classicist and a philosopher of the time who happened to be part of the zeitgeist of the time. He also has these moments when he's not so deep in his funk, a bit more of the bright, insightful bits, or in his manic depression or his polarity of his outputs. That this represents something more where it's like, this is something you can rely on. And it's not just interesting, it's compelling. It's truth, you know. So this is something I wanted to get from Heidegger today, to confiscate it, as it was said, when otherwise they won't be making apologetics for things that kind of go without saying, is discarded, these things which are kept. And that was a pretty good quote. The inner construction, the fundamental concepts, and the particular questions of general and specific grammar as the science of languages in the broader sense have stood for centuries and even today still stand under the domination of the logic in question. We are only now slowly beginning to comprehend that as a result of this, the whole science of linguistics and thus philology as well rest on shaky foundations. Well, I don't know about that because those are accounts according to usage. The philology through the lens and through the lens, as it were, the archaeological aspects and the paleoclassical aspects, and the linguistics itself is modern and it's just understanding and usage of the day. The science of it, here it is about the metaphor and the Coleridge language, which only eventually fails to the strong metonymy that beyond a science of it, there's a theory of it as part of like given as part of the word, or after there's described a nothing in space and then nothing in words, that these are the kinds of things. One way to look at that is with regards to the realm of set theory and cardinal numbers in set theory. So what I mean by this is describing the difference between the space of geometry and the space of words. So the space of geometry can be considered like points in the connections, the continuity, the connectedness, what results, surfaces, shapes, substances, and forms. And that is as of a whole and its continuous differentiation throughout. Whereas words are lanterns and signposts, and discrete fundamentally is the idea. They are the building blocks in the sea of space and time. So the idea about cardinal numbers is this, is that a cardinal number is, in set theory, what it is the equivalence class, meaning there's an equivalence relation between any two sets, and they either relate or they don't. And so an equivalence class contains all the possible sets that relate to each other, even transitively, because it's said for a transitive type of relation that is this kind of equivalence, that if A relates to B and B relates to C, then A relates to C. Okay. So the cardinal number 1 is the largest equivalence class of all these possible things in one sense. So starting at the beginning, there's only one empty set in the theory. Now, that's an axiom, because it could be that there are infinitely many empty sets of different types, say, or different things. But it's an axiom in ZF set theory that there's one element. And so getting into whether that empty could also be infinite is its own deal, and it is a thing. Similarly, the universe of these either contains itself or not. It's either a fragment or extension. But there's only one of those, is the idea, too. Now, there's only one of empty and one of universe. But the singletons, the sets with cardinality equal to 1, with one member, they have a single member, so they're singletons, has that this is, in a sense, the largest cardinal there is. It doesn't even exist in the universe of ZFS cardinals. Yet as a cardinal, the equivalence class of cardinals that is 1, the equivalence class of sets that is cardinal 1, is the largest cardinal set that it could be. It's kind of like a top cardinal, a super cardinal. So I maybe think of that as in terms of being kind of like points or numbers that like then they just build all the way out to what they could be, from point A all the way out to point B. So then the other idea is that in the middle of set theory, if you imagine all the sets with about half the elements of the universe, those have the top super cardinal, because the equivalence class of those is, according to Combinix vis-a-vis this account in the space, having the very most possible ways it can be. Like for n choose k, and the n choose n over 2 is got the most that there can be of the combinations. So it just goes to show that could help show that the same universe of objects in a theory like set theory and ordinary set theory even then it's to be figured out. It's like, well, we've just expanded our comprehension to include these notions of the super cardinal. For one is the loneliest number and the biggest. And then also there's like, well, it's kind of like if you take the universe and half of it, then the most of those are about in the middle. And then that's like words. So it's just to show the same space has got two beginnings, and where we generally arrive at it in terms of relaying things is somehow in the middle of all the things. Vis-a-vis in the universe, all space and time, it doesn't really say where the origin is, except it's usually said that it's everywhere. But then that's the geometric continuum of things, vis-a-vis the infinitude of all the possible combinations of words. This metaphor that arrives in a metonymy that's this continuum, much like the geometric continuum can then break down into things, discrete things, whole numbers, for example. So that's just brought as part of the technical accoutrement to go with foundations, because axiomatic set theory and descriptive set theory is usually called the foundations, or the candidate for foundations in mathematics. And it is. And then that this other stuff that comes and goes into it is also part of that. And then it helps to show here is kind of inspired by this quote about the logos mostly, because of its multiple required roles and its being replete and how it's complete. That these are the kinds of things that it gets into. The inner construction, the fundamental concepts. We are only now slowly beginning to comprehend that. As a result of this, the whole science of linguistics and thus philology as well rests on shaky foundations. Or here they don't. They're perfectly well founded and discovered and profound. This reveals itself every day in philology with reference to a simple state of affairs. Well, that was a pretty simple state of affairs. When a poem is made the object of philological interpretation, the resources of grammar find themselves at a loss, and precisely with respect to the greatest creations of language. Well, that's where Heidegger is a great fan and believer in poetry is more significant than technical language, and that's fair because it can say so much. Sad songs say so much and this kind of thing. Yet at the same time, here we have our Coleridge and Comenius language together, and they go well together, and they're done. They complete. To provide some general orientation as to the way in which I develop the problem of the logos as regards metaphysics and its context, I shall point to those places where I have dealt with the logos problem, and done so in a form that deviates from our present approach. In the context of our present problem, we shall pursue other directions of questioning. Being in time and Kant and the problem of metaphysics, and the entire third part of the book on the essence of ground. The problem of the logos in Leibniz in the context of the metaphysical question concerning being. These are merely major stages within the history of the problem. They do not provide a complete orientation regarding the development of the problematic itself. Here, that's what's considered what would be profound. And so foundations here as an approach is like, this is considered the candidate for foundations. That there is one at all, and then it says, well, it's got to be axiomless natural deduction. It's got to get something from nothing. It considers things like the empty set being infinite and what it means to axiomatize that regular. It considers things like the infinite set being extraordinary and what it means to axiomatize that regular when it's not. And then how to arrive at what gets something to approach to for this fuller Aristotelian dialectic course, and all the greatest of the canon and the greatest of the reasons that come back and go back into it to help arrive at why just sometimes these philosophers are so great in reaching kind of a next round, reaching kind of a next stage, reaching kind of a next level. At the same time, it's like there's a whole other course up the mountain, and they all need to arrive at once, is kind of the thing. And that's not easily accomplished by stopping and going back down every time. Yet it is possible, if contrived. These are merely major stages within the history of the problem. They do not provide a complete orientation regarding the development of the problematic itself. It says, A. The logos in its general conception, discourse as meaning, giving something to be understood. The occurrence of agreement that holds together as condition of the possibility of discourse. So this is the intersubjectivity and towards what would be an objectivity and an interobjectivity. We shall first consider what Aristotle says in general about the logos. Logos means discourse, everything that is spoken and sayable. The Greeks really have no word corresponding to our word language. Logos as discourse means what we understand by language, yet it also means more than our vocabulary taken as a whole. So the Greeks might say glossa for their language. It means the fundamental faculty of being able to talk discursively and accordingly to speak. The Greeks thus characterize man as something logos, egos. That living being that essentially possesses the possibility of discourse. Now, I really need to make an exercise to study the Greek alphabet and Greek letters as what form Greek words, because I'm somewhat limited beyond a very only shallow recognition understanding of these symbols. But they'll follow as defined kind of in this way. I'd probably attach some further definition to them as well. The animal, as a living being that lacks this possibility of discourse, is alogos. This definition of man then passed over into the traditional conception of man, in keeping with which, for reasons we shall not pursue now, logos was later translated by the Latin ratio. So ratio is rationality, and logos as ratio is not so much as it's just untranslated usually in Latin, and so it would be logicus and this kind of stuff for, but it's for rhetoric, and so the speech and this kind of thing and truth are also related to logos and these kinds of things. Yet rationality is considered a part of it, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's for the word or the discursive part of it, because ratio would also just mean like the Pythagorean, the rational, numerically. It was then said that man is animal rationale, a living being with reason. This is kind of like the man as mind bit. From this definition, you can see how the decisive problem in antiquity, where man is defined from the perspective of discourse and language, now becomes lost, and how language is only introduced again as an afterthought, whereby the whole problematic is left without its roots. Well, I don't know about that, because that's for linguists and studies of language, and the means of language and the reason in language to arrive at that. There were other terms for this concept. And so Heidegger has put this through a funnel through which the fuller meaning doesn't fit, but he doesn't include all the other viaducts and conduits that make it so that what the rest of the story is about these things comes in and comes down. So the Latin with regards to stuff like the verum and the certum, that which is true and that which is resoundingly true, as with regards to discourse, il discorso, that probably logos would be then most be reflected by il discorso and something like that with regards to that Heidegger here has kind of picked one thing that he says it relates to just the mere faculty of reasoning, as with regards to discourse and communication, that does not fully encompass the meaning of the word, which is a pretty rich word, logos. So, the logos gives something to be understood. This essential function of discourse has a character of its own, which Aristotle points to concisely when he says, logos, epes, mer, sum, verticos. And I'll have to give up there before I kind of get that wrong. Keta su this given to be understood of discourse is not a functioning such as we are acquainted with in the case of the organ, a functioning that set in motion is necessarily impelled to accomplish something. It is not fusus. Discoursing is not a series of events such as digestion or blood circulation. It is... At a preceding point in the text, Aristotle provides an explication of this expression, which is decisive for an insight into the essence of discourse. The logos is... No word of language is what it is on the basis of a purely physical connection, on the basis of a natural event, such as when, in the case of the animal, for existence, a cry is triggered off due to some physiological state. Rather, the word, indeed, every word is whenever a symbol occurs. So he's talking about the difference, and then he gets into matters of signals and information and communication, and as with regards to those having any given number of meanings. And here that's, for the metaphor is weak and eventually fails in the technical, in the universals, I mean, not anytime soon. Yet as well, it can address many things at once. For example, is like before deciding that it's to be defined logos as this one particular way, that it has to fulfill all its roles that it does in the language from where it arrives. This was kind of reflects on the earlier statements, like any natural language can say anything from any other natural language, given enough time and context and resources. So then Heidegger gets in kind of like a phoneme account, an account of inscrutable utterances. We have thus achieved some initial understanding of what the inner possibility of the logos consists in, taken in this quite broad sense. However, Aristotle says, every logos indeed gives something to be understood, but not every discourse is an exhibiting, i.e. one which, in the manner in which it gives something to be understood, has the specific tendency merely to exhibit as such whatever it is referring to. By propositional statement, we mean only the logos discourse that points out. Requesting, for example, is a non-apophantic logos. If my discourse is requesting, then it is not attempting to inform the other person about something in the sense of increasing his or her knowledge. I will disagree, because it affects generally the sense that there's an unknown, and whether a question means to like confirm what I think, or I'm telling you I don't know something, has that it can be multiple things, and so that it's not just so much this simple syllogistic next line please. Instead of that, it's an opening, and then it kind of speaks to this interrogative theory that just came up in the last episode. Has that Heidegger, once again, is kind of clammed up, and so he starts filling pages full of reasons why other people should too. So, yeah, Heidegger, I'll often put down kind of unsatisfied, except insofar as that I don't agree. Every logos is, which is why Aristotle also says that logos is a forming of understandability occurring by way of vocal utterance, or textual, or a symbol, or otherwise a signal. But not every logos is. The question is, which logos is apophantic and how does it become such? What is the distinguishing feature of propositional discourse compared to all other kinds of discourse? Well, kind of like in the talk of principle of sufficient reason before, we don't need a principle of perfection because everything says something, even if it doesn't say much at all or says it's just something missing. So, in a sense, there's a way to look at it that it is quite usually so, and it doesn't need much change to the meaning of the word because it already has kind of a fuller definition, the intent and the disposition than Heidegger has here as of his command, say. That doesn't exist is his problem. Well, all right, but there's much to be gained from this because it helps a lot that he's very well studied and turned over in the knockabout many times these things with regards to then, as another kind of point to reflect this with Nozick's description and lens, is then he gets the unity of things, and as with regards to why that he uses a very similar term with the organic unity, as mentioned in Nozick, that Heidegger is most clearly a very significant influence on what went into that. Connectedness as the meaning of the is in the assertion. So here we have quite a wealth of copulas in English. And for example, Heidegger says, if this is the case, then does this also belong to that of the copula? If being is connectedness, it also means being taken apart. Where do they spring from? The theory of the logos thus leads directly into the most central problems of metaphysics. We are not, however, as Kant thinks, faced with ultimate concepts that resist further analysis. So this is B then. What being, that being, and being true as possible interpretations of the copula. The undifferentiated manifold of these meanings as the primary essence of the copula. What relates? What connects? What forms the copula in language of is, and otherwise relates. Usually, the relates is the term. Vis-a-vis the is-a and has-a. Often. We shall try to explicate the possible interpretations of the copula. To explicate the manifold of possible interpretations of the copula. Is and being then mean connectedness. Is means something is connected with, stands in connection with, respectus logicus. So this has helped a little bit just to explain where logos, the word, comes from. The word, in its discourse, and its intent, and its conveyance, and its receipt. On the other hand, however, we have heard about components of the logos, so-called parts of speech. And then we have these, and he talks about subject term, predicate term, copula. And then as regards to a greater account of grammar, like today, like Kerm's grammar is a little bit more rich and involved. With regards to the specifics of the technicality and the richness of English, like with this 40 or 50 copulas besides is, that are in regular usage. It's affecting generally to relates and to be connected, as it were. By 1770, this is from Egginton about Borges, Kant, and Heisenberg. Kant decided that the British approach suffered from a serious flaw. As he formulated the problem around the time, the doctrine of moral feeling is more a hypothesis to explain the phenomena of approval that we give to some kinds of action than one which could determine maximums and first principles to hold objectively and tell us how we should approve or reject something. So this is kind of in a section about subspecie aeternitatis, after human the principle of morals and something. So that's not really so what I had found in this book were some great questions and points about infinity and infinitesimals. Borges was injured, and in May 1939 he published this story after several months of convalescence. And then it was a time in Argentina where Borges kind of was and wasn't, like the director of a library, and then in various political regimes he was cast out and kicked around, but then when those regimes rose and fell, then they were very volatile and unstable, and so it arrived that then again he for a long time he was not just a man of letters, but also very much part of the government, the system, the regime, as it were, that came and went. Borges, about Cicero. Among them the Roman orator Cicero, who countered that if the 21 letters of the alphabet were thrown together onto the ground, I doubt whether chance could possibly create even a single verse to read. Cicero's challenged, lost in his municipal library, lost in life, Borges would begin to question if he could ever put anything in his own words. The number of atoms in the world being finite, he said, in an infinite stretch of time, the number of possible permutations must be run through, and the universe has to repeat itself. See, we kind of started here today with that Leibniz has that the universe is infinite, and the monads are infinitely many, and so the atoms would be infinitely many, so that some of these things that were given to Borges as after like quantum mechanics and like a finite universe after finite things don't resolve the problem. There's no problem with that again, from having solved kind of a bigger problem. Talking about the infinite time in which things must eventually occur has no more meaning than referring to the infinity to my right. In other words, Borges adds, if time is infinite to our intuition, so is space. With this twist, Borges invoked none other than Immanuel Kant. Space and time, as Kant wrote, are the necessary forms taken by our intuition of an otherwise chaotic influx of sensory data. Here there's a mathematical universe hypothesis where space and time actually arise, so it's not necessarily so that otherwise that kind of, judgment holds, because there's unsustained stipulations that are built into it. They're said to not hold. So there's something to be said that this could be a great salve to Borges, because his intuition is reaching to like, there is the thing. There really is the thing. For as Kant showed, if we conceive of the universe as if it were an object in time and space, we run headfirst into an impossible contradiction. No, we don't. We even have the principle of sufficient reason, given a law of continuity and a principle of perfection. Thanks, Leibniz. Or Leibniz. Leibniz or Leibniz. Well, good afternoon, good day, generators, fellow Earthlings. And warm regards, happy holidays, we'd say.